I was woken up by the notification sound, that sharp little chime that used to make me smile, thinking it might be my grandson sending me a sweet message, but I thought wrong. You're not invited. I stared at my phone screen, my heart hammering against my ribs as I read the full message. Grandma, about tonight's dinner. My wife Marie thinks it might be better if you didn't come. You know how important this is for my career. Maybe next time. But here's what Joseph didn't know as he sent that text. Probably with his wife Marie, whispering in his ear about how embarrassing his working-class grandmother would be in front of his boss and potential clients. Here's what neither of them understood as they planned their perfect evening without the woman who made it all possible. And I was about to teach him exactly what happens when you bite the hand that's been feeding you for 23 years. If you've ever given everything only to be treated like you're nothing, then you need to hear this story. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what I'm about to tell you will change how you think about family, money, and the power of a grandmother's love turned into a grandmother's reckoning. But before I tell you about the nuclear bomb I was about to drop on their perfect little world, I need you to understand how we got here. I need you to see the woman I was before I became the woman who would change everything with a single phone call. My name is Martha Henderson. I was 59 years old and looking forward to a peaceful retirement when the phone call came that changed everything forever. It was a Tuesday night in October, and I was in my garden, deadheading roses and planning what I'd plant the following spring. I'd worked 40 years as a registered nurse, finally paid off my modest 2-bedroom house, and was looking forward to quiet days filled with books and flowers and maybe some travel. Then my phone rang. "Ma'am, this is Officer Rodriguez with the state police. I'm calling about your daughter Mercy and her husband Michael." The world stopped. Time became thick and heavy, like moving through honey. I remember dropping my gardening shears, the metallic clang echoing in the suddenly silent evening air. I remember sinking onto my garden bench, the rough wood scratching against my palms as I gripped it for support. "There's been an accident," the officer continued, his voice gentle but firm. "A drunk driver ran a red light. I'm so sorry, ma'am, but they didn't survive the impact." Mercy. My only child, my beautiful, brilliant daughter who'd inherited her father's quick wit and my stubborn determination, gone at 34, just when her life was really beginning. Michael, my son-in-law who'd become the son I'd never had, who called me every Sunday just to chat about baseball scores and ask how my garden was growing. Gone. But then the officer said something that cut through my grief like a knife. "Ma'am, there's a 5-year-old boy, Joseph. He was staying with a babysitter when the accident happened. Child Services needs to know, is there a family who can take him?" Joseph. My grandson, a beautiful, brilliant little boy who looked just like his mother at that age, with the same curious green eyes and unruly dark hair. A child who was about to wake up tomorrow in a world where Mommy and Daddy would never come home again. Joseph's paternal grandparents were in their 80s and could barely manage their own daily care, let alone handle a grieving child. His father's siblings lived across the country and had made it painfully clear that taking in an orphan wasn't in their 5-year plans. "It's such a tragedy," his Aunt Patricia had said over the phone, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "But we just couldn't possibly, you understand." The state was already talking about foster care when I stepped forward and said those words that would define the next 2 decades of my life. "He's coming home with me." I'll never forget the first time I saw Joseph after the accident. He was sitting in a child psychologist's office, small and silent, clutching a stuffed elephant that his mother had given him for his 4th birthday. His little face was pale and confused, and when he saw me, he ran into my arms and whispered, "Grandma, when are Mommy and Daddy coming back?" "They can't come back, sweetheart," I whispered into his hair, my own tears falling freely. "But I'm here. Grandma's here, and I'm never going to leave you." Joseph was broken when he came to live with me. This beautiful, brilliant little boy who'd gone from having everything, loving parents, a comfortable home, a bright future, to having nothing but a grandmother who was starting over at an age when most people are winding down. He'd wake up screaming from nightmares, calling for his mommy and daddy with a desperation that broke my heart every single night. He wouldn't eat, barely spoke, and flinched when anyone tried to hug him. The grief counselor warned me that it might take years for him to feel safe again, that some children never fully recover from trauma this severe. I threw myself into learning how to be a parent again at 59. I read every book on child psychology I could find. I rearranged my entire house to make it child-friendly. I painted his room in bright blues and greens, filled it with books and toys, and put up pictures of his parents so he'd never forget their faces. Slowly, day by day, we built a new life together. I taught him that even though his parents were gone, he wasn't alone. I showed him that love didn't die with loss, it just took new forms. When he woke up screaming from nightmares, I'd hold him until the terror passed, singing the same lullabies I'd sung to his mother decades before. When he was 7 and wanted to try Little League baseball like his dad used to play, I worked double shifts at the hospital so I could afford his equipment. When he was 10 and struggled with math, I hired a tutor even though it meant eating rice and beans for a month. When he was 12 and came home crying because kids at school called him an orphan, I held him while he sobbed and told him that being chosen by love was just as valuable as being born to it. But raising a grieving child alone at my age wasn't easy. There were nights when I'd lie awake wondering if I was strong enough, if I was doing right by him, if I was giving him what he needed. My retirement savings dwindled as I paid for therapy, tutoring, sports equipment, and all the things that growing children need. My dreams of travel and leisure were replaced by parent-teacher conferences and Little League games. High school brought new challenges. Joseph was brilliant, just like his mother had been. But he was also angry. Angry at the world for taking his parents, angry at God for making him different from his friends, angry at fate for forcing him to grow up with his elderly grandmother instead of young, cool parents like everyone else had. When Joseph started talking about college, my heart soared with pride and terror in equal measure. He was brilliant. Straight A's, captain of the debate team, accepted to Princeton University with its ivy-covered walls and $50,000 annual tuition. Princeton, the same school his father had attended, the place where his parents had met and fallen in love. When that acceptance letter arrived, I cried for 3 hours straight. Pride because my grandson had achieved something extraordinary. Terror because I knew what accepting that offer would mean for both of us, financially. I sold everything I could. My mother's china set that had been in our family for 3 generations. My wedding jewelry that I'd been saving to pass down to Joseph's future wife. The antique furniture I'd inherited from my parents. Even the car I'd been driving for 15 years went to help fund his education. I took out a second mortgage on my house, the house I'd worked 40 years to pay off. I cashed in my retirement savings, every penny I'd been planning to live on in my golden years. I picked up every extra shift the hospital would give me, working 12-hour days well into my 60s, when other women my age were playing with their grandchildren and taking cruises. For 4 years I lived on nothing but the absolute basics. No new clothes, no dining out, no small luxuries that might brighten an aging woman's days. I sent every spare penny to my grandson so he could have the education his parents would have wanted him to have, so he could build the future they'd dreamed of for him. But every sacrifice was worth it. When I heard the pride in his voice as he talked about his classes, his professors, his dreams for the future. Every ache in my aging body was worth it when he called to tell me he'd made Dean's List. When he got internships with prestigious companies, when he started talking about the man he was becoming. The day Joseph graduated from Princeton University was the proudest day of my entire life. I sat in that auditorium in my best dress, a 20-year-old black outfit I'd worn to his parents' funeral, and watched my grandson walk across that stage in his cap and gown. When they called his name, I cried harder than I had since the day his parents died. But these were tears of joy, of accomplishment, of a promise kept to my daughter. In that moment, every sleepless night, every double shift, every sacrifice seemed not just worthwhile, but sacred. I thought I'd raised someone who understood the value of sacrifice, the importance of family, the meaning of loyalty. I thought I'd raised a grandson who would never forget where he came from or who got him there. I was so beautifully, heartbreakingly wrong. Marie Whitman walked into our lives like a perfectly manicured storm 2 years after Joseph's graduation. She was everything I wasn't: young, polished, wealthy, sophisticated. Investment banker, trust fund baby, the kind of woman whose designer shoes cost more than my monthly pension. She had perfectly straight teeth, perfectly styled hair, and a perfectly condescending smile that she wore whenever she had to acknowledge my existence. But the red flags started small. So small that I questioned whether I was imagining things or just being an overprotective grandmother who couldn't stand to share her grandson's affection. Marie would correct my grammar at dinner, always with that sweet smile and a little laugh that made it seem playful rather than cruel. "It's Joseph and I. Not me and Joseph," she'd say, like she was gently teaching a child who didn't know any better. She'd explain investment strategies to me like I was mentally impaired, using small words and speaking slowly. "Now, Martha, a 401k is a retirement account that..." She'd begin, completely ignoring the fact that I'd been managing my own finances and Joseph's college fund for over 20 years. She had this way of making suggestions that weren't really suggestions at all, but commands disguised as helpful advice. "Joseph, don't you think you deserve better opportunities than spending your Saturday helping your grandmother balance her checkbook?" she'd say, her voice dripping with false concern. Successful people delegate those kinds of tasks to professionals. But I bit my tongue because Joseph was happy. I could see it in his eyes when he looked at her, hear it in his voice when he talked about their future together. I swallowed my pride because I could see how much he loved her, how much he wanted to build a life with this sophisticated, successful woman. I accepted her backhanded compliments and subtle put-downs because I thought that's what grandmothers do. We sacrifice our own comfort for our grandchildren's happiness. When they got engaged after 18 months of dating, Marie immediately began planning what she called the wedding of the century. $40,000 for one day. $40,000 that could have paid off my second mortgage, could have given me some financial security in my retirement, could have funded the assisted living facility I was secretly researching for when I became too old to live alone. It's tradition for both families to contribute, Marie explained to me over lunch at a restaurant where the appetizers cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. She said it so matter-of-factly, like it was obvious that a retired nurse living on a pension should somehow come up with $20,000 for flowers and catering for people who looked at me like I was the hired help. She knew exactly what she was doing. Marie's family could have funded 10 weddings without feeling the financial impact. But she wanted to see if I'd do it. She wanted to test just how far I'd go, how much I'd sacrifice, how completely I'd bankrupt myself for my grandson's happiness. It was a power play disguised as tradition, and I fell for it completely. But seeing Joseph's face on his wedding day, seeing him so happy and proud as he introduced me to his new in-laws as the most important woman in my life, made every aching joint and sleepless night worth it. The real change happened after their honeymoon. It was subtle at first, so gradual that I almost didn't notice it happening. Suddenly, Joseph was too busy for our weekly dinners that we'd maintained for 18 years. Dinners that had been our sacred time when we'd catch up on each other's lives and remember that we were family. Too important for our Sunday phone calls that had gotten me through countless lonely evenings since his grandfather's death. Too sophisticated for movie nights in my little living room, where we'd watch old comedies and share a bowl of popcorn like we had when he was a teenager. Marie had opinions about everything in my life, and she wasn't shy about sharing them with increasing boldness as the months passed. My house was outdated and not the kind of place where successful people visit. My retirement from nursing was premature because I could still be useful if I applied myself properly. My presence at their events was awkward for their friends who weren't used to being around elderly people who didn't understand modern social dynamics. But what hurt the most wasn't Marie's increasingly open cruelty. It was watching my grandson, the boy I'd held through nightmares, the teenager I'd worked myself to exhaustion to put through college, the young man who'd called me his hero at his graduation, slowly started agreeing with her. When I suggested we maintain our weekly dinners, Joseph would glance at Marie before saying, "Actually, Grandma, Marie's right. We really do need to focus on our careers right now." When I invited them to simple family gatherings, I'd watch him defer to her disapproving looks before declining. When I called to check in on him, I could hear her sighing dramatically in the background, making it clear that my presence in his life was an inconvenience. But here's what neither Joseph nor Marie knew, what I'd kept hidden for 3 long years, as I watched their entitled behavior escalate. 3 years before Marie waltzed into our lives with her designer handbags and condescending smiles, something extraordinary happened to me that would change everything. Mrs. Mabel Blackwood was 87 years old when I started caring for her as a private nurse during my retirement. I'd taken the job not because I needed the money, though my pension was modest, but because I needed the purpose. After spending 18 years raising Joseph, my empty house felt too quiet, too lonely. Mabel was wealthy beyond anything I'd ever encountered, but she was also lonely and forgotten by a world that had moved on without her. She lived in this massive estate in Connecticut, surrounded by priceless antiques and family portraits, with nothing but a bitter nephew named Richard, who showed up exactly once in the 5 years I knew her. And that was only to ask when she planned to update her will. "I'm here because you need someone to care about you," I replied honestly. "And because I have a lot of love to give, with nowhere to put it." Something in my voice must have convinced her, because she smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. "Well," she said, "that's refreshingly honest. Would you like some tea?" For 5 years, I spent my days with Mabel. We'd sit in her garden drinking tea while she told me about her late husband's business empire, about the charities she'd supported before arthritis confined her to her home, about the family that had forgotten her existence the moment her husband's will was read. I'd braid her thinning hair, help her with her medications, and most importantly, I'd listen. Really listen. Not because I had to, but because I genuinely cared about this forgotten woman who had so much love left to give. When Mabel passed away peacefully in her sleep on a Tuesday morning in March, I thought I was losing a friend. I had no idea I was about to inherit a fortune that would dwarf anything I'd ever imagined. $8 million. Let me say that again. $8 million. Plus her estate in Connecticut, investment portfolios I didn't even understand, stocks and bonds and assets I'd never heard of. The lawyers explained that she'd been planning this for years, updating her will every few months to leave everything to me. "You were the only person who ever showed her genuine kindness," they told me. "She said you treated her like family when her real family had forgotten she existed." I sat in that lawyer's office in complete shock, staring at documents that transformed me from a retired nurse living on a pension to one of the wealthiest women in my state. The numbers were so large they seemed fictional, like something from a movie rather than my real life. So I made a decision that would define the next 3 years of our lives. I kept living exactly as I had before. Same modest house, same careful budgeting, same humble lifestyle. I wanted to see what kind of man my grandson would become, without the influence of money. Without knowing that his grandmother had gone from pension-living retiree to multimillionaire overnight. I set up a trust fund in his name that he didn't know existed. I paid off his Princeton student loans anonymously, through a fake scholarship program I created called the Future Leaders Foundation. I covered his rent by having my lawyer pose as a property management company, offering housing assistance to promising young professionals. When his car broke down, a mysterious insurance settlement covered the repairs. When he needed a security deposit for a better apartment, a clerical error at his bank resulted in a windfall. Joseph thought he was making it on his own. Talented, hardworking, independent. He'd call me so proudly, talking about how his hard work was paying off, how he'd gotten lucky with scholarships and housing assistance, how life was finally working out after all the hardships of his childhood. I'd smile and congratulate him, never letting on that his success story was being quietly funded by the grandmother he was slowly learning to take for granted. And that's when Marie started making her demands. It began small, like everything else with her. "Joseph's car is so embarrassing," she'd mention casually during family dinner, her voice dripping with disdain. "He deserves something more professional for his new position, something that reflects his potential." Then she'd look at me with those calculating eyes and add, "I'm sure you want him to make a good impression at work, don't you, Martha?" Before I knew what was happening, I was writing a check for a down payment on a BMW. Not because Joseph had asked, he was still humble enough to be embarrassed by the request, but because Marie had convinced him he needed it, and convinced me that refusing would somehow harm my grandson's career prospects. Then it was the house. "We can't keep living in that tiny apartment," Marie announced 6 months after their wedding, her voice filled with the kind of entitlement that comes from never having wanted for anything. "Joseph's colleagues are starting to invite us to dinner parties at their homes. We need something appropriate for entertaining, something that shows we're serious about our careers." Their credit cards were maxed out from the wedding, so naturally, that became my problem too. "It's just temporary," Marie assured me as I transferred thousands to pay off their debt, her voice sweet with false gratitude. "Just until Joseph gets his promotion. Just until we get settled in the new house. Just until my trust fund kicks in next year." But Marie's trust fund was apparently tied up in legal issues that never seemed to resolve. And Joseph's promotion was always just around the corner, but never quite materialized. And their temporary financial difficulties became my permanent responsibility, an endless cycle of requests disguised as emergencies. I said yes every time, watching my grandson transform from the grateful, hardworking young man I'd raised into someone I barely recognized. Someone entitled. Someone who expected my sacrifice without gratitude. Someone who stopped saying thank you and started saying things like, "Grandma can handle it, and she doesn't mind helping out." The most heartbreaking part was watching Joseph slowly adopt Marie's attitude toward me. The grandson who'd once called me his hero now looked embarrassed when Marie criticized my clothes or my house. The young man who'd proudly introduced me to his college friends now made excuses for why I couldn't meet his work colleagues. The boy who'd once told me I was the strongest person he knew now sided with his wife when she suggested I was holding him back. With my small-town mentality, what would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you keep on agreeing to their demands, or would you say no? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories like this. The final straw came last month when Marie announced they were hosting a dinner party for Joseph's boss and potential clients. "It's crucial for his career," she explained, already planning my exclusion from an event I'd apparently be funding. "We need to make the right impression. This could be the opportunity that changes everything for Joseph's future." When Joseph called asking for money to cater the event, I could hear Marie coaching him in the background. Her voice was crystal clear through the phone. "Tell her it's for networking. Tell her it's important. Remind her that his career depends on it. Make sure she understands how much this means to us." $3,000 for professional catering, for a dinner party I wasn't invited to, for a grandson who couldn't even look me in the eye anymore when he asked for money. $3,000 from the woman who'd raised him from a traumatized orphan, who'd sacrificed her retirement to give him opportunities, who'd worked herself to exhaustion so he could have the life his parents had dreamed of for him. I said yes, like I always did. I transferred the money immediately, my heart breaking a little more with each keystroke, and then I asked the question that would shatter what was left of my illusions about our relationship. What time should I arrive? Should I bring anything besides my famous apple pie? The silence on the phone felt like falling off a cliff. I could actually hear Marie whispering frantically in the background, and could picture Joseph's face as he realized what he was about to do to the woman who'd given him everything. "Grandma," Joseph finally said, his voice strained and uncomfortable, "this is really more of a professional thing. Marie thinks." "Marie thinks what?" I interrupted, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it through the phone. "She thinks it might be better if you sit this one out. Give us space to focus on business. It's not personal, it's just professional." Professional. The woman who'd taken in a 5-year-old orphan when no one else would, who'd sacrificed her retirement to raise him, who'd worked herself to exhaustion to fund his Princeton education, and was currently paying for the very dinner he was excluding me from. I was now too unprofessional for his company. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at those cooling cookies I'd been baking for a grandson who no longer wanted me in his life. The flour I'd spilled earlier was still scattered across the floor, a physical reminder of the moment my world had shifted on its axis. But I wasn't done with surprises. Not even close. That evening, as they prepared for their important dinner party, as Marie arranged flowers I'd paid for, and Joseph practiced networking conversations with people who would never know that his success was built on his grandmother's hidden millions, I sent a single text message that would change their lives forever. "Enjoy your party. Check your bank account." Then I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. "Richard," I said when he answered, "it's Martha Henderson. I need you to freeze everything. Every account, every payment, every cent that's been supporting my grandson. I want it all stopped immediately." 23 years of financial support vanished with a series of phone calls. I froze the trust fund that had been paying Joseph's salary supplements for years. I stopped the automatic payments on their mortgage, the mortgage I'd been covering without them even knowing. I canceled the credit cards I'd been paying off monthly. I halted the car loans, the insurance payments, the mysterious scholarships and grants that had been smoothing their path for years. In one evening, Joseph and Marie went from comfortable and secure to completely exposed, and they had no idea why their financial world was crumbling around them. What happened next would teach them exactly what their precious networking dinner had really cost them. The calls started at midnight. That same notification sound that had haunted me earlier, but this time it was music to my ears because I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of that phone. First, it was Joseph. Panicked, confused, his voice cracking like it hadn't since he was 13 years old and had broken Mrs. Patterson's window with a baseball. "Grandma, what did you do? The catering company is demanding immediate payment. Their credit card readers are all saying declined." Marie's freaking out completely. Her boss is here with his wife and the other clients, and there's no food, and the florist is threatening to take back the arrangements, and you're embarrassed, I finished for him, my voice calm as still water. "How does it feel, Joseph? How does it feel to be humiliated in front of people who matter to you? How does it feel to have your perfect evening crumble because the person funding it isn't good enough to be part of it?" For the first time in years, my grandson was speechless. Completely, utterly speechless. In the background, I could hear the chaos unfolding like a symphony of karma. Marie shrieking at vendors, her carefully composed facade crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. I could hear voices of confused guests, the clatter of caterers packing up their equipment, the sound of their perfect evening disintegrating in real time. "I don't understand," Joseph stammered, his voice small and lost like the 5-year-old boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. The payment went through this morning. You transferred the money. I saw it in our account. Oh, you saw it? I said, my heart breaking even as I held firm. But did you ever wonder where it went after that? Did you ever question why your account always seemed to have just enough money when you needed it most? Did you ever ask yourself how a recent college graduate could afford a BMW and a $500,000 house on an entry-level salary? Then Marie grabbed the phone, and for the first time since I'd known her, I heard her real voice. Not the polished, condescending tone she usually used with me, but raw, desperate panic mixed with genuine fury. "You can't do this," she screamed, her voice shrill with disbelief. "That money belongs to Joseph. You're his grandmother. You're supposed to support him. You're supposed to help your family. This is sabotage." "I did support him," I said, my voice steady as granite even though my hands were shaking. "For 23 years. Every single day. Every sacrifice, every dollar I never spent on myself, every dream I gave up so he could have his." "But you made it crystal clear that I'm not family anymore, Marie. You made that decision when you decided I wasn't good enough to share a meal with your important friends. So why should family money be your concern?" The line went dead. They hung up on me. The woman who had just saved their entire evening from complete disaster, who had been secretly funding their lifestyle for years, and they hung up on me like I was a telemarketer interrupting their dinner. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The phone rang again, 20 minutes later. This time it was Joseph, and I could hear him crying. Actually crying, like he hadn't since the day we buried his parents. "Grandma, please," he sobbed. "The guests are leaving. Marie's boss thinks we're frauds. The caterers are demanding cash payment or they're calling the police. I don't understand what's happening. Why would you do this to me?" And there it was. The question that broke my heart completely. Not, what did I do wrong? Or how can I fix this? But, why would you do this to me? As if I was the villain in this story. As if I was the one who had betrayed family bonds and forgotten where love comes from. "Joseph," I said quietly, "I want you to think very carefully about what you just asked me. You want to know why I would do this to you. But let me ask you something. What did you do to me?" "I didn't do anything," he protested, his voice cracking with emotion. "I just wanted to have a nice dinner for my career." Marie said I wasn't good enough to attend a dinner I was paying for," I interrupted. "Marie said I was too unprofessional to meet the people whose meal I was funding. And you agreed with her. You chose her embarrassment over my heart, Joseph. You chose their comfort over my dignity." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear him breathing, could practically hear his mind trying to process what I was telling him. But you always help," he whispered finally. "You always say yes, you never mind." "I always minded, sweetheart," I said, my voice breaking despite my resolve. "I minded every time you stopped calling. I minded every time you canceled our dinners. I minded every time you looked embarrassed to introduce me to your friends. I minded every time Marie treated me like hired help while spending my money. But I kept saying yes because I love you, and I thought that's what love meant. I thought love meant disappearing whenever I became inconvenient." "The money will stay frozen until you understand something very important," I continued. "I am not your personal bank account. I am not your backup plan. I am not the grandmother who exists only to write checks and then disappear when you need to impress people. I am a human being who deserves respect, and I am done accepting anything less." The next morning, Joseph showed up at my apartment looking like he hadn't slept in days. His hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, his eyes red and wild with panic and confusion. For just a moment, seeing him standing in my doorway like that, I saw my little boy again. The scared 5-year-old who'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. The confused 12-year-old who'd come to me crying when the other kids made fun of his situation. For one heartbreaking second, I saw the child who'd needed his grandmother's protection and comfort. But then he opened his mouth. and that illusion shattered completely. "You're destroying my marriage," he said, pushing past me into my small apartment without even being invited in. "Marie's family thinks we're poor frauds now. Her father was supposed to invest in my business venture, but after last night's disaster, he's having second thoughts. You're ruining everything I've worked for, Grandma. Everything." I stared at him, this man I'd raised from a broken child, this person I'd sacrificed everything to create, and I started laughing. Not the kind of laughter that comes from joy, but the bitter, hollow sound that escapes when reality becomes so absurd that your mind can't process it any other way. "Everything you've worked for?" I repeated, the laughter dying in my throat. "Joseph, you haven't worked for anything. Not one single thing. Every opportunity, every advantage, every dollar that's made your comfortable life possible, it all came from me, the grandmother you're now too ashamed to have at dinner." Joseph's face went white as paper. "What are you talking about?" "Sit down," I said, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used since he was a teenager breaking curfew. "Because it's time you learned the truth about your successful, independent life." That's when I told him everything. Every single detail I'd kept hidden for 3 years. About Mrs. Mabel Blackwood and the inheritance that had changed everything. About the $8 million I'd been sitting on while continuing to live modestly. About the trust fund I'd created in his name. The anonymous scholarship programs. The mysterious financial assistance that had smoothed every rough patch in his adult life. Joseph's face went through every emotion I'd felt over the past year. Shock, as he realized the magnitude of what I was telling him. Disbelief, as he tried to process that his modest, pension-living grandmother was actually a multi-millionaire. Anger, as he understood that I'd been testing him this entire time, watching him fail a test he didn't even know he was taking. And finally, devastating understanding as the truth of his situation hit him like a freight train. $8 million? He whispered, his voice barely audible. "You had $8 million this whole time and let me think. Let me believe that I was making it on my own." "I let you think you were strong enough to make it on your own," I interrupted, my voice firm with the conviction I'd been building for months. "I wanted to raise a man, Joseph. A man who understood the value of hard work, who appreciated sacrifice, who never forgot where he came from or who helped him get there. But Marie got the spoiled child anyway, didn't she?" Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that seemed decades older than they had an hour before and asked the question I'd been dreading. "What happens now?" "Now," I said, my voice firm with resolve I'd been building for months, "you learn what it's like to stand on your own. Really stand on your own. No trust fund payments, no mysterious financial assistance, no grandmother cleaning up your messes from behind the scenes. You wanted independence from the embarrassing woman who raised you? Congratulations. You've got it." But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. I walked to my bedroom and returned with a manila folder I'd been preparing for months. A documentation of everything that had led to this moment. Inside was evidence of every insult, every slight, every time Marie had treated me like hired help while spending my money. Screenshots of group chats where she'd mocked my clothes to her friends, calling me Joseph's tragic grandmother with her thrift store wardrobe. Text message threads where she'd made fun of my house, my lifestyle, my small-town mentality. Photos she'd posted on social media from events where I'd been deliberately excluded, funded by checks I'd written. But the most damning evidence was the video recordings I'd started making at family gatherings after I realized what was happening. Marie openly disrespecting me, correcting my grammar, explaining basic concepts like I was mentally impaired, while Joseph sat there in silence. Not defending me, not standing up for the woman who'd given him everything, just letting his wife humiliate his grandmother because it was easier than confronting her. "Your wife has been planning to cut me out of your life for years," I said, spreading the evidence across my coffee table like a prosecutor presenting a case. "Every insult, every manipulation, every strategy to isolate you from your own family. It's all documented here. She thought she was marrying your money, Joseph. She had no idea she was actually marrying mine, and now she has neither. She never loved me, he whispered, his voice broken. She loved what she thought I could provide, and I let her treat you like this. I sat there and watched her hurt you, and I did nothing. And what did you love, Joseph? I asked quietly, my heart breaking as I asked the question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Did you love me? Or did you just love how convenient it was to have a grandmother who always said yes, who always opened her wallet, who always disappeared when you needed her to? He couldn't answer that question. Tears were streaming down his face as he stared at the evidence of his betrayal, his complicity, his failure to protect the woman who'd protected him his entire life. Because the truth was about to get so much worse, and we both knew it. The divorce papers were filed 3 weeks later. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for Marie's undying love and commitment to evaporate once she realized the gravy train had permanently left the station. Turns out Marie's love was exactly as conditional as I'd suspected all along. Without the financial security she thought Joseph possessed, without the trust fund she'd been spending, without the mysterious windfalls that had been funding their lifestyle, their fairy tale romance crumbled faster than a sandcastle at high tide. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Marie had moved out within days of learning the truth about the money. She didn't even try to work things out, didn't suggest counseling or compromise or any of the things people do when they're fighting for a relationship they actually value. She just packed her designer clothes, took everything of value she could carry, and walked away from the man she'd claimed to love more than life itself. Because apparently, love has a price tag, and Joseph's had just been marked down to clearance. The most heartbreaking part was watching Joseph realize that his marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. Not just Marie's lies about loving him for who he was, but his own lies about the life he'd built. Every achievement he'd been proud of, every milestone he'd celebrated, every moment of success, all of it had been subsidized by the woman he'd learned to treat as an embarrassment. Joseph tried to come home after that, showing up at my door apologetic and broken, expecting immediate forgiveness, and, if I'm being honest, probably expecting financial rescue too. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed, unshaven, wearing the same clothes he'd had on 2 days earlier. His expensive apartment was being foreclosed on, his BMW was being repossessed, and the business venture he'd been so proud of had collapsed when Marie's father withdrew his promised investment. But I'd learned something important in my 67 years on this earth. Enabling bad behavior isn't love, it's cruelty. Rescuing someone from the consequences of their choices isn't kindness, it's crippling them. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for someone is let them fall. I'll always be your grandmother, I told him, standing firm in my doorway instead of stepping aside to let him in. But I won't be your victim anymore. You want a relationship with me? Earn it. You want my respect? Show me the man I raised is still in there somewhere, buried under all that entitlement and selfishness. But Grandma, he pleaded, his voice breaking, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to live without help. I've never had to budget or worry about money or... Then you'll learn, I said, my heart breaking even as I held firm. The same way I learned when I took in a 5-year-old orphan at 59. The same way I learned to be a parent again when I should have been enjoying my retirement. You'll learn because you have to, and because learning is the only way you'll ever become the man your parents would have been proud of. For 6 months, Joseph struggled. Real struggle. Not the manufactured hardships that Marie had convinced him were beneath someone of his education and breeding. He worked multiple jobs, waiting tables at a diner, not unlike the one where I'd worked when I was young, delivering food for a app-based service, even cleaning offices like I used to do to pay for his baseball equipment. He moved into a studio apartment smaller than the closet in the house I'd helped him buy. He shopped at thrift stores and discount groceries, budgeted every dollar like I'd taught him to do with his allowance 20 years ago. He learned to compare prices and clip coupons and choose generic brands because name brands were a luxury he couldn't afford. I watched from a distance, my heart breaking and healing simultaneously. Breaking because seeing your child, even your adult grandchild, struggle is the hardest thing a grandmother can endure, no matter how necessary that struggle might be. Healing because I finally saw glimpses of the boy I'd raised. The one who understood hard work, who appreciated what he had, who didn't take kindness for granted. If you're watching this and you've ever had to make the hardest decision of your life, choosing tough love over easy enablement, hit that subscribe button, because you understand how difficult but necessary this journey was. Today, Joseph and I have dinner every Sunday. Real dinner, where we talk and laugh and remember why we loved each other in the first place. We cook together, sharing recipes and stories, rebuilding the bond that had been strained by years of taking each other for granted. He's engaged to Jennifer, a kindergarten teacher who hugs me every time she sees me and remembers my birthday without prompting or reminders. She brings me flowers from her school garden and asks about my week, like she genuinely cares about the answer. When Joseph introduces us, he does it with pride. "This is my grandmother, the strongest woman I know." He calls me because he misses me, not because he needs something. He visits because he enjoys my company, not because he's obligated or guilty. He introduces me to his friends with pride instead of embarrassment. When people ask about his success, he tells them about the grandmother who believed in him enough to let him fail. As for Marie, last I heard she'd moved back to New York, still convinced she was the victim in our story. Some people never learn that you can't buy character, and you can't fake class. I imagine she's found some other man to manipulate, some other family to infiltrate and divide. But that's not my problem anymore. As for me, I'm finally living for myself. I bought a beautiful house by the lake with a garden where I grow my own vegetables and flowers. I started painting again, something I'd abandoned decades ago when Joseph was small, and I didn't have time for hobbies. I travel when I want to, not just when I can afford to. Visiting places I'd only dreamed about when I was counting quarters for diaper money. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between enabling someone you love and teaching them a hard lesson? Because that choice, between comfortable lies and difficult truths, that's where real love lives. I'm Martha Henderson, and this is my story. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.